Hey friends, Jeannie here with another week of our devotional series. We're talking about the four Gospels. Last week we talked about the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew presents Jesus as a teacher of Israel. The week before that we talked about the four Gospels as a whole and why you should study them and how you can study them. If you haven't seen those videos, I want to encourage you to go back and watch them. They're on Facebook, they're on YouTube, so you have access to them. This week, we're going to talk about the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to dive right in, which is exactly what Mark does. He jumps right in, and he starts with Jesus' ministry, Jesus fully grown. And in his Gospel, Mark's Gospel is often called the Gospel of Action. So where Matthew focused more on Jesus' teaching, Mark focuses on the actions of Jesus and what Jesus is doing. And he presents Jesus as a bounding lion. And so from that, you get this rushing tone all throughout the Gospel of Mark. He's rushing through what Jesus did in his ministry. And it reads kind of like a run-on story, like when a 7-year-old tries to tell a story. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And you get this rushing tone all throughout the Gospel of Mark. But he slows down a couple of different times throughout his gospel. The first time that you see Mark slowing down is when he stops to explain Jewish terms and customs. Now, a Jewish audience would already know what those terms meant, so that tells us he wasn't writing to a Jewish audience. He's writing to a Gentile audience. So he slows down to explain the Jewish terms and customs. And the second time he slows down is for the last third of the Gospel of Mark. So if you split up the Gospel of Mark into sections, the first 2/3, he's rushing through Jesus' life, this and then this and then this. And then the last third is the last week of Jesus' life. He slows way down and stretches that week out, which shows that that's really important. And he emphasizes that in his Gospel. Now, one thing that is very interesting to me about the Gospel of Mark is its abrupt ending. Mark ends in chapter 16, verse 8. If you have your Bible open, you can turn there, and you'll see that there are some more verses after verse 8. And if your Bible does have more verses listed there, it probably also has a note with something that says something like, early manuscripts stopped at verse 8, but later manuscripts included more verses. Just know that the agreed upon ending is verse 8. And if you stop in verse 8, it has a really abrupt ending. So let me tell you a little bit of context of the story, what's happening at the end of the Gospel of Mark. So this is Sunday morning after Sabbath is over, after Jesus has died, and Mary and the other women are headed to the headed to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body with oils and spices and all of that. And so they're on their way there, and they get to the tomb, and they see that the stone has been rolled away, and that Jesus' body is gone, and they start freaking out. I would be freaking out too. But an angel shows up and explains to them what has happened. He says that Jesus is risen from the dead, and he calls them to go and tell others. And what happens is they run away scared. And that's where the story ends. I'm not kidding. It's kind of an abrupt ending. Now, there are several logical reasons why the women would be freaking out and why they would run away scared. And maybe you can think of a bunch of these logical reasons. I mean, there's just the craziness of it all. This was something totally new. There was the fact that they were women and that had something to say about their place and their status in society and whether people would believe what they had to say. There's all of these logical reasons. And maybe you can think of some logical excuses too. But the fact of the matter is, they were called to go and tell. And we share in that calling. God calls us to go and tell. And we can spend all of this time getting caught up in logical excuses why we can't do that or why something else is something. And God's saying, no, don't get caught up in the logical excuses. Go and tell. Mark doesn't have another chapter because it's still being written, and we're the main characters. We are the continuation of the story. God's called us to go and tell. We're supposed to continue the story. So how are you continuing the story? How are you going to respond?